We're looking forward to the time that we can all come back together in the worship center and be able to be together to worship. But we're so thankful. Right now we have the opportunity to worship in this way, worship online together. And so we are so glad that you have joined us as we've come together to spend some time talking about the Lord today. So I want to tell you a story about a farmer. This farmer, he loaned his mule out to another farmer for some plow work. And after about an hour or so, the farmer came back to his friend and said, he said, that mule won't do a thing. I can't even get him to back up and hook up to the plow. Well, the first farmer said, well, let's go have a look at him. And as they're walking next door to check on the mule, the first farmer picks up a 2x4. And they get over there, and when he got to the mule, he looked at the mule and he said, "Mule, let's go." And the mule just totally ignored him. He didn't budge. So the farmer took the 2x4 and whacked the mule across the nose. And the mule shook his head and looked up. And the farmer said, "Okay, mule, now let's go." And the mule just followed him wherever he went. The neighbor just stood there real wide-eyed trying to figure out what was going on. And the first farmer said, see, he's a pretty good mule, but sometimes you just got to get his attention. Have you ever tried to talk to someone and they had their nose buried in a phone, or they had their attention buried in the TV and they were watching that, and you ask them a question and then you wait and wait and wait for a response? No response comes. Then you raise your voice and you ask them a little bit louder the same question, and you wait and no response comes. And finally, you either scream the question next to your friend or your loved one, or you get up and you get between them and their distraction and ask them the question again. Well, has that person ever acted like they didn't hear the question the first time? You know, I'm not saying that we need to hit anybody across the head with a 2x4, even though that might be tempting sometimes. But what's it going to take to get our attention? So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about, can you hear me now? Moses was a guy in the Old Testament, and he needed something to happen in order to get his attention. And so to understand Moses, we need to go back a little to his birth. Moses was an Israelite, and he lived thousands of years before Jesus. And he was born in Egypt during a time when the Israelites were slaves to the Egyptians. And the Israelites were growing in number, and as a matter of fact, they were growing so fast that they were beginning to outnumber their slaveholders, the Egyptians. And so the Pharaoh began to be worried about that. And to help stop the population growth of the Israelites, an order was issued by Pharaoh that all the baby boys that were born were supposed to be killed by the midwives who helped deliver the babies. Well, Moses' mother developed a plan to save him when he was born. She hid him for a while, and then when she could no longer hide him, she made this basket, and she placed Moses in this basket and put him in the Nile River. At the same time, Pharaoh's daughter was coming to the Nile to take a bath. Well, Pharaoh's daughter found him in this little basket, and she raised him up to be her own son. Well, fast forward about 40 years, and Moses was about 40 years old, and he was out walking around in Egypt, and he saw one of the Egyptian slave drivers abusing an Israelite and beating him. Well, Moses tried to get him to stop, and when Moses tried to get him to stop, he wound up killing the Egyptian. Fearing that he would be punished, he ran away from Egypt in order to save his life. So Moses went to a place called Midian, and he lived there for another 40 years. Basically, what we know about Moses from the time he was 40 till the time he was 80 is that he moved to Midian to get away from Egypt and being punished for killing the Egyptian there. And he met and married his wife, and he became a shepherd. That's pretty much what we know about Moses for that 40-year span of his life. So when Moses was 80, he was out tending the fields and taking care of the flock of sheep that belonged to his father-in-law Jethro. And we have no record of the kind of relationship that Moses had with God before he was 80 years old. But as he was taking care of his father-in-law's sheep, God did something to get Moses' attention. And we can pick up that story in Exodus chapter 3. The writer of Exodus writes this. It says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Moses said, Here am I. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your shoes, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. You see, God got Moses' attention with a burning bush. See, when God finally got Moses' attention, he was able to tell Moses that he had a plan for his life. God called Moses to go and to help the Israelites be set free from their slavery. And at first, Moses gave all kinds of excuses to not go. He did not want to do what God called him to do. And he kept not only giving God excuses, he said, God, why don't you send somebody else? God said that Moses was the one to do this job. And I want you to notice what Moses asked God next. Again, we pick up the story in Exodus 3. The writer writes, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. To help make a longer story short, we find out that Moses eventually says yes to God. And what's interesting is, if you want to, you can go back and read in Exodus, a book in the Old Testament, the second book of the Old Testament. You can read how in Exodus 3 and Exodus 4, the rest of the story about Moses getting ready to go back to Egypt. But what I want us to do is, I want us to focus on this part of the story for just a minute. You see, the Israelites were God's chosen people. And I want you to notice how God said to tell the people that he was the God of their fathers, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You see, every Israelite would have known these three men, because every Israelite in Egypt was descended from these three men. They should have known the God that these three men had followed. But the problem was, they were living in Egypt, and they had been in Egypt for some 400 years. And the Egyptians, they had many, many gods that they served. And their gods had all these different names. And so the Israelites, having lived in Egypt for 400 years, they had lived in the Egyptian culture for that long. And they had become accustomed to all of these other gods. And there's a high likelihood that many of the Israelites even worshiped some of these gods. Moses wanted God's name so that the Israelites would know exactly who was sending Moses. He didn't want there to be any confusion. So when Moses finally got to Egypt, he had a problem with Pharaoh. Pharaoh didn't want to let the Israelites go, and he made life even more miserable for them because Moses asked to set them free. So what happened is God had to get Pharaoh's attention. And we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 5. In the first verse, the writer of Exodus writes, he says, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Now I want to confess something to you. I believe that we have just read one of the stupidest questions in all of history. This is the dumbest question in all of history. Pharaoh was very familiar with all these many other gods because Egypt was filled with a host of different gods. But he was not familiar with the one true God. And he said, "Who is this God that I should obey him?" You see, Pharaoh had never heard of this God of Israel. I want you to think about it for just a minute. Since the Israelites were his slaves, Pharaoh assumed that this God of theirs must not be very powerful. He was not worried about this message from Moses because he had not seen any evidence of God's power in the lives of God's people. That's a sad commentary on the people of Israel at that time. So Moses, he warned Pharaoh what would happen if he didn't let the Hebrews go, the Israelites go. And we continue with the story in verse 3 of Exodus 5. It says, "Then they said," Moses and Aaron said this to Pharaoh, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword." Listen. Not only had God gotten Moses' attention with a burning bush, but God now had to get Pharaoh's attention. And God got Pharaoh's attention with 10 plagues. See, Moses told Pharaoh that even though he didn't know God, that if he didn't obey God, that God would make himself known to Pharaoh in a very powerful way. God would get Pharaoh's attention. Now listen, don't miss this. Pharaoh didn't fear God because in Egypt at that time, Pharaoh was considered the most powerful god of all. And in Pharaoh's mind, there was nothing more powerful than himself. See, God was getting ready to get Pharaoh's attention in a way that would leave no doubt as to who the real God was. So what God did is God sent a series of plagues to Egypt. He sent 10 plagues into Egypt. And each plague only affected the Egyptians. They did not affect the Israelites. And somebody might wonder, why 10 plagues? Well, the reason there were 10 plagues is very simple. Each plague was meant to come against one of the top 10 gods of Egypt. And so each plague was used to show that the real God was more powerful than Egypt's top 10. And the final plague that came about, the final one, was the death of the firstborn in each home that chose to disobey God. To help you understand that a little bit and help us understand it, see, God told the people through Moses to prepare a very special meal to eat on the night that the death angel was going to come through Egypt. And this special meal became what is known as the Passover. And the reason it's called the Passover is because when the people were told to eat this special meal and to dress in traveling clothes, and then they were also told to take the blood of a unblemished lamb and to place it on the doorpost and above the door of each house. And when the death angel came that night, he would pass over the houses that had the blood around the door. What's the significance of this last plague? Why is it a big deal? Well, God doesn't leave anything to chance, so he tells us why it's a big deal. So we pick up the story a little bit later in Exodus 12, in verse 12 and 13, we find out what's going on. It says, on that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. And now, catch this. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when, when I strike Egypt. It's very interesting that we see this. You see, God is saying he's going to bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. In other words, he's taken on the top 10, and this is the last one, and he is going to show he is the most powerful. God was telling the people that after that night, there would be no doubt as to who the true God was. Remember Pharaoh? Pharaoh thought of himself as the most powerful God. So of the top 10, Pharaoh was number 1. And on that night, because Pharaoh did not believe in the one true God, thought of himself as God, Pharaoh's firstborn son died. Pharaoh was not powerful enough to save his own son. Have you ever wondered, do you really think that Pharaoh ever thought about the question he asked Moses and Aaron when he first met them? Who is this Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I wonder if he thought about him that next morning after the last plague came. Well, God uses some unexpected sources to get our attention. See, God spoke to Moses from an unexpected source. God spoke to Moses from a burning bush that was not being consumed. God used that bush to get Moses' attention. I mean, think about it. Moses was just minding his own business. He was just tending to the sheep that belonged to his father-in-law, and he noticed this bush that was being burned but was not being consumed, and it got his attention. Next, we see how God spoke to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians and to the Hebrews from another unexpected source. It took 10 plagues to get Pharaoh's attention. The Egyptians and the Hebrews were not just watching a movie with Charlton Heston playing Moses and Yul Brynner playing the Pharaoh, and I know some of you are going to have to go Google that. These people, these Egyptians and these Israelites, they were eyewitnesses to these 10 plagues. God didn't just get Pharaoh's attention, he got the attention of a whole nation. How many of you remember that commercial, the old Verizon commercial? Had the guy walking all over the place, and his catch line was, "Can you hear me now?" Have you ever thought that God might be saying that to us right now? Have you ever thought that God may be trying to get our attention? Have you ever thought that right now, at this time in history, that God is trying to get our attention? Listen, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I want to make something very, very clear. I'm not saying that God has caused the coronavirus in order to get our attention. I'm not saying that. I don't believe that this is a plague brought on us by God to punish us. I don't believe that it's one of the plagues in the end times that Revelation talks about. I don't believe that this disease targets people who are bad in order to punish them. Or I don't believe it targets people who are good in order to test their faith. I just don't believe that. I don't think God would do that. Quite honestly, I just believe that people sometimes get sick. It's not because they're good or they're bad. It's because they're people. And it's a consequence. The reason we have sickness, it's a consequence of living in a fallen, imperfect world where there are diseases all around us. See, I believe that people get sick is because the reason we get sick is because we are frail, imperfect humans, and we will sometimes get sick because we live in an imperfect world that is filled with sickness. I don't believe the coronavirus is a curse or a punishment from God. I believe it's a disease, pure and simple. But what I do believe is that while God did not cause this disease, I believe that He can use this disease to get our attention. I believe that God is speaking, but the question is, are we paying attention to Him? See, at this unprecedented time in our lives, we have the opportunity to spend some time in our homes with our loved ones and work on those relationships that we've taken for granted. Maybe God's speaking that we need to do that. Right now we have an opportunity to call and FaceTime each other and call and FaceTime people who are hurting and who are afraid and who are stressed and who are anxious, and we get a chance to show them that we love them just by listening to them. We have an opportunity to look beyond ourselves and pray for those who are on the front line fighting this disease, the doctors and nurses and the healthcare workers who are out there, the first responders who are dealing with this much more than any of us lay people are. Right now we have an opportunity to give thanks for the farmers who faithfully planted their crops for us to eat, and for those who are working in the stores, who are stocking the shelves with that food that we need. We have an opportunity right now to give thanks and pray for all those truckers who are delivering all those much-needed supplies. And we have an opportunity to pray for those who are working to keep those truckers on the road. We have an opportunity to pray for people who are affected by this virus through the loss of their jobs or through the cut in their salaries. Right now we have an opportunity to give thanks that we have a home to live in and pray for those who don't. We have the opportunity to do some soul searching and see if there are some things in our lives that we need to get rid of that just really are not that important. Right now, in the midst of all that we are dealing with all the shutdown and all the stores being closed and all the things that we're going through, we have an opportunity to reprioritize our lives and really see what is the most important thing that we need to focus on. See, for far too long, we have told God that we're too busy to read the Bible and we're too busy to pray. And now we find we have time because we're not going out and we're not busy doing a whole lot of other things that have taken us away from God. God is speaking. Are we listening? I have a good friend by the name of Johnny Johnson. And one day during his prayer time, Johnny felt led by God to write a post and put it on Facebook. And Johnny never realized the impact that his post would make on so many people. And as I was writing this message, his post had already been shared over or almost 153,000 times. I shared Johnny's post on my Facebook page, and I asked him if I could share it in this message, and I told him I'd give him credit. He said I didn't need to do that. I said, no, you're going to get credit for it. And I want to read to you his post. He said, in 3 short months, just like He did with the plagues of Egypt, God has taken away everything we worship. God said, you want to worship athletes? I will shut down the stadiums. You want to worship musicians? I will shut down civic centers. You want to worship actors? I will shut down theaters. You want to worship money? I will shut down the economy and collapse the stock market. You don't want to go to church and worship me? I will make it where you can't go to church. Then Johnny quoted a verse from 2 Chronicles. He said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Johnny finished up his quote, his post with this. He said, maybe we don't need a vaccine. Maybe we need to take this time of isolation from the distractions of the world and have a personal revival where we focus on the only thing in the world that really matters. Jesus. I agree with Johnny. Right now we have an opportunity to hear from God. But the question is, are we listening? Will you pray with me? Father, we've allowed so much to distract us. We've allowed so much to get in our way. We've allowed so much to take our focus off of you and onto something else. So, Father, I pray that we would refocus right now on you. I pray, Heavenly Father, that we would hear from you. For those who need to come to know you as a personal Savior and accept you, I pray that they would begin a relationship with you by praying this very simple prayer. You can pray this prayer right where you are right now. God, just say it in your words, in your own words, but you can remember it with these 4 simple words. The first one is sorry. God, I'm sorry that I've rejected you up to this point. I'm sorry that I have taken the focus off of you and onto me. I'm sorry for my sin. The next word is please. Please forgive me of my sins. Please come into my life and save me. And please become the Lord of my life. And the last 2 words are thank you. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for becoming my Lord and my Savior. Father, for those who have prayed that prayer for the first time today in minute, I pray that you would help them to grow in their relationship with you and help them to not get so busy that they forget about you. For others of us who are already Christ followers, we've allowed the distractions to take our attention away from you. I pray, Heavenly Father, that you would help us to focus on you now and help us to realize just how great you are and how much you love us. For it's in your name I pray. Amen.
Oh Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe display. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And when I think that God his son not sparing, sent him to die. I scarce can take it in that on the cross my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great